when I told her what I'd done, I got the reaction really was pretty amazing. My mom is 91 years old tomorrow. It's still very clear in her mind. But this is, of all the fond memories I have of my mother, this is the defining memory. She got up out of her chair without saying a word. She just walked up to me. She put her arms around my neck and pulled me down and put a kiss on my cheek. And she said, "David, I can't imagine what you've been struggling with. David, I know that you love Ted. I know that you wouldn't have done this unless you truly felt that you had to." And then I had to tell her that the police were waiting outside, you know. And here she is. Her world is turned on end within a space of 15 minutes. And here she is meeting with the agents, and with a mother's intuition, what does she start to do? She starts to do mitigation. You know, she sends me to her closet where she has this footlocker with her souvenirs of her 2 sons. She's got baby shoes, she's got letters, she's got college papers, she's got family pictures. What happens when you put together a mother with family pictures? You get stories. But all of Mom's stories had an agenda. It was, look at our family. You know, Ted was a good kid. You know, he was never in trouble. At one point, she pulled up like his baby book, a little blue book, a diary she kept during the first year of his life, and said, "Sir, would you like to see this? This is the diary, you know, of first year of Ted's life." And, you know, the poignancy of that gesture wasn't lost on me. It was as much to say, don't ever forget that there's a human dimension to this tragedy. This is the little baby that came out of my womb 55 years ago, you know, somebody I've loved and worried about ever since because of his struggles with mental illness. Ted was arrested about a week later. Apparently there had been a leak to the media. So the media comes back in here as a boogeyman, I guess, again. We were really shocked because on the day that Ted was arrested, the media swarmed our house. And I remember as I was watching the television, one of the evening anchors said to me, said to the world, you know, there's an interesting sidelight to this story. Apparently, Kaczynski was turned in by his own brother. Now, we'd been promised by law enforcement that we would be treated as confidential informants. In their words, nobody would ever know your role in this investigation. And now the whole world knows, and there's no way to take it back. And I'm feeling devastated by apparently the proof that Ted is, in fact, the Unabomber. They found another live bomb in his cabin and lots of incriminating evidence. But also this tremendous violation of confidence. And as our house is surrounded, all of the sensitive, we were an open book to law enforcement. Anything that could help them carry the investigation forward, we shared with them. And now it was shared with the entire world as it was being printed on the pages of the New York Times. I guess at this point, you know, I was feeling tremendously violated. I was feeling like I was carrying the stigma of my brother, but also a certain stigma of what I had done in turning in my own brother. It was hard to almost see beyond the horizon of this situation. I guess our only hope was that maybe Ted's life would be spared, because in those months that I had spent with the FBI talking about my brother, showing them all the evidence, talking about our visits to psychiatrists, at least they knew who they were dealing with, not a terrorist in the normal sense, not a sadistic serial killer, but someone with a severe mental illness called schizophrenia. But pretty soon I had my awakening. I saw how the system began to work. The prosecutor hired a forensic psychiatrist, and his name is Park Dietz. I don't know if that's known to many of, the name is familiar to many of you, but he's essentially a hired gun, almost always testifies for the prosecution, has involved himself in many death penalty cases, either denying or minimizing the defendant's claim of mental illness. This is the same psychiatrist who testified against Andrea Yates, the woman with profound schizophrenia who had drowned her 7 children in a delusional state. And all of a sudden I'm waking up and I'm seeing, hey, there's no Solomon here. This isn't about fairness. And you know, there's no mercy for us. There's no consideration for us based on what we had done in attempting to protect the public. I suppose there was another critical decision we had to make at this point. We had hired an attorney to help us work with the FBI and turn Ted in. And that attorney came to me. Here I'm feeling really angry at the media. I'm feeling like so exposed and very vulnerable. And my attorney sits down with me and he says, David, I know you don't want to do this, but you got to go to the media. You know, this is a high-profile story. The New York Times wants to do an interview with you. If you don't tell your brother's story, the prosecutors will. You don't really have a choice here. If you want your brother to be seen as a human being, if you want people to understand that he's mentally ill, if you want people to remember the sacrifice that your family has made to protect the public, you have to be the one to tell this story. So we did a whole thing on the Sunday New York Times, you know, incredible privilege. Those of you who have represented capital defendants realize you don't have this kind of access. Believe me, I did not feel lucky. I did not feel privileged while going through this nightmare. But in retrospect, I was incredibly lucky and incredibly privileged. And that's why Ted is alive today. We ultimately went on 60 Minutes. By the time the trial was rolling around, federal death penalty trial 2 years later, we had gotten the media on our side. In the midst of this, I think the prosecution tried to counter it. Now, my brother had written something like 40,000 pages in his diaries. Certain selections of those diaries were sort of leaked to the media by the prosecution. They weren't the parts of the diary that would be helpful to saving his life. They were the parts that would inflame public opinion against him. And so I was waking up to the realization that this is not about justice. This is really about politics. And you use the media to try to achieve a political purpose, the same as if I was trying to get elected to office, only now I'm trying to save my brother's life. Ted's trial was abortive. His mental illness sort of derailed the whole thing. He tried to fire his attorneys, and it went from what looked like a hopeless nightmare. Perhaps you've heard about cases like Scott Panetti, who got sentenced to death in Texas after serving as his own defense attorney, despite his serious schizophrenia, or the case of Charles Singleton, who had to be medicated to be executed because he was found incompetent to be executed. He didn't even know what an execution was without medication. But with the friendly media, with the trial sort of coming apart at the seams because of Ted's illness, the Justice Department offered a plea bargain, and my brother's life was spared. I suppose at that point, I'd been consumed with a mission for 2 years to try to save my brother's life. I'm now thinking, how am I going to live the rest of my life? How am I going to get my life back? How am I going to learn to smile again? How am I going to have privacy? Actually, the privacy part wasn't as hard as it might have been. Mom and I rented an apartment in Sacramento, California for Ted's trial. And on the day after Ted got his plea bargain, President Clinton was on TV giving probably one of the most watched interviews of his political career. He was being interviewed by Jim Lehrer of the NewsHour, and the phrase that everybody remembers from that interview was, "I did not have sex with that woman." And believe me, at that moment, there wasn't any of those reporters that had any interest in speaking to anybody named Kaczynski anymore. They were now booking flights for Washington, D.C. to try to get an interview with somebody named Lewinsky. And so in some sense, the pressure was off. But the life experience, believe me, it has a kind of resonance. I suppose I was somewhat depressed for a while.